Brian adjusted his tie in the mirror, his excitement building as he prepared for his and Emma's 15th wedding anniversary. He was in his late 30s, a hard-working man who had always prided himself on being a family-first kind of person. He had been planning this day for weeks, a candlelit dinner at home, complete with Emma's favourite flowers, her favourite wine, and a small box containing a diamond necklace. As the morning sun streamed into their bedroom, Brian leaned over to kiss Emma on the cheek. Her auburn hair fell gracefully across her pillow as she stirred. "Happy anniversary, love," he whispered softly. Emma's eyes fluttered open, and she smiled faintly. "Happy anniversary," she murmured, her voice groggy but warm. Brian grinned. "Can you believe it's been 15 years already?" Emma stretched lazily. "It feels like just yesterday we were dancing at our wedding," she replied, though her tone had a hint of distraction. Brian noticed, but he brushed it off. "I have a surprise for you tonight," he said, trying to contain his excitement. "I was thinking a fancy dinner at home, something special, just for us." Emma sat up, her expression suddenly more alert. "That sounds wonderful," she said quickly, though Brian noticed a flicker of hesitation in her eyes. "But I have Pilates at 5 p.m. Can we push dinner back a little?" Brian's brow furrowed for a moment. Emma had never mentioned taking Pilates classes on Wednesdays. Still, he dismissed the thought. "Of course," he said with a smile. "That gives me more time to make everything perfect." As he kissed her goodbye and left for work, a small knot of unease settled in his stomach. He shook it off, reminding himself of the day's significance. After all, they had built a life together, raising 2 kids, navigating life's ups and downs, and sharing countless memories. Tonight was about celebrating that journey. At the office, Brian couldn't focus. His thoughts kept drifting to Emma. They'd been through so much together, and he wanted her to know just how much she still meant to him. By lunchtime, an idea struck him. He would leave work early, pick up her favourite flowers, grab the same wine they had shared on their first date, and set up a romantic dinner at home. He poked his head into his manager's office. "Tom, do you mind if I leave a little early today? It's our anniversary, and I want to surprise Emma." Tom smiled and nodded. "Go make it a night to remember, Brian." By 4:30 p.m., Brian was pulling into their driveway, a bouquet of lilies in one hand and the bottle of wine in the other. In his pocket was the small jewelry box holding the necklace. But as he parked, something caught his attention. A car he didn't recognize was parked in front of their house. His first thought was that it might belong to a neighbor or a delivery driver. Shaking off the momentary curiosity, he unlocked the front door and stepped inside. The house was unusually quiet. "Emma?" he called out. There was no answer. He walked into the kitchen and set the flowers and wine on the counter. As he began arranging everything, he heard faint voices upstairs. His brow furrowed. Emma didn't usually have visitors during the day. He assumed she might be on a call, but something about the tone of the voices felt off. Quietly, he climbed the stairs, his heart pounding in his chest. The muffled voices grew clearer, and as he approached their bedroom, he froze. A distinct laugh, a man's laugh, echoed from behind the partially closed door. Brian's stomach churned. He slowly pushed the door open, his hands trembling. What he saw made his world come crashing down. Emma was on the bed, laughing and tangled in the sheets with another man. For a moment, Brian couldn't breathe. The room spun around him as he tried to make sense of what he was seeing. Emma's smile vanished the second she noticed him standing there. Her face turned pale, and the man beside her sat up, looking startled. "Brian," Emma stammered, pulling the sheet up to cover herself. "What are you doing home?" Brian's voice was cold and steady, though it quivered with barely contained rage. "This is how you celebrate 15 years with me?" he asked, his heart breaking with every word. Emma's eyes filled with panic. "Brian, it's not what it looks like," she said hurriedly, but the words sounded hollow even to her. Brian shook his head, his fists clenched. "Don't," he said, his voice rising slightly. "Don't insult me by pretending this is anything other than what it is." The man, still sitting awkwardly on the bed, quickly grabbed his shirt and stood. "I should go," he muttered, avoiding Brian's piercing glare. Brian took a step forward, his anger boiling over. "You're not going anywhere," he said firmly. Emma stood up, tears streaming down her face. "Brian, please, just let him go. We can talk about this." But Brian wasn't ready to hear her excuses. The betrayal was too fresh, the wound too deep. As the man stumbled out of the room, Brian turned back to Emma, his voice trembling with emotion. "Why?" he asked. "Why would you do this to me, to us, after everything we've been through?" Emma sobbed, shaking her head. "I don't know. I didn't mean for this to happen." Brian stared at her, his heart shattered into pieces. "You didn't mean for this to happen," he repeated bitterly. "You made a choice, Emma, over and over again." He turned and walked out of the room, unable to bear the sight of her any longer. As he grabbed his bag and left the house, he knew that this anniversary would be the day that changed everything. Brian sat in his car, parked just a few blocks away from home. The bouquet of lilies rested on the passenger seat, now forgotten, their vibrant colours a cruel contrast to the storm raging inside him. He stared blankly at the steering wheel, replaying the scene he had walked in on over and over again. 15 years. 15 years of marriage, countless memories, sacrifices, and love. All of it felt meaningless in that moment. A deep ache settled in his chest as he struggled to comprehend Emma's betrayal. He picked up his phone and dialed his closest friend, Alex, a practical and grounded guy he had known since college. After a couple of rings, Alex's voice came through. "Brian, everything okay?" Alex's tone was concerned. Brian wasn't the type to call out of the blue. "No," Brian replied, his voice cracking. I need to talk. Can I come over?" "Of course," Alex said without hesitation. "I'll make coffee. Come by any time." Brian drove to Alex's apartment in silence, the weight of his thoughts pressing down on him. When he arrived, Alex opened the door and immediately noticed Brian's pale, distraught face. "What happened?" Alex asked, ushering him inside. Brian sank into the couch, his head in his hands. "Emma," he said, barely able to get the words out. "I caught her with someone else." Alex's eyes widened in shock. "What? Emma? Are you sure?" Brian nodded, his jaw tight. "I saw it with my own eyes. She didn't even try to deny it." Alex sat down beside him, his expression somber. "Man, I'm so sorry. I can't imagine how you're feeling right now." Brian sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Angry, hurt, humiliated. I don't even know where to start. I left the house, but now what? What about the kids? What about everything we've built together?" Alex placed a hand on Brian's shoulder. "First things first, take some time to process this. Don't make any decisions while you're in this state. You need to think clearly before you decide what's next." Brian nodded, though his mind was anything but clear. He spent the night at Alex's, tossing and turning on the couch, unable to sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Emma's face, her guilty expression, her panicked tears. The next morning, Brian woke up early and decided to head back home to face the reality of his situation. When he arrived, the house was eerily quiet. Emma was sitting at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a steaming cup of coffee. She looked up as he entered, her eyes red and puffy from crying. "Brian," she said softly, standing up. He raised a hand to stop her. "Don't," he said, his voice cold and measured. "I didn't come back for excuses or apologies. I came to talk about the kids and how we're going to handle this moving forward." Emma's face crumpled, but she nodded. "I understand," she whispered. Brian sat down across from her, his gaze steady. I need to know the truth, Emma. How long has this been going on? She hesitated, her hands trembling as she set her cup down. It's been a few months, she admitted, her voice barely audible. Brian's stomach churned. A few months. While he had been planning surprises, taking care of their family, and trusting her implicitly, she had been living a lie. Why? He asked, his voice heavy with pain. Was it something I did? Something I didn't do? Emma shook her head, tears spilling down her cheeks. It wasn't you, Brian. It was me. I felt lost, unseen, like I was just a wife and a mother, and nothing else. Brian stared at her in disbelief. So, your solution was to betray me, to throw away everything we've built. I didn't mean to hurt you, she said through her sobs. Well, you did, Brian said, his voice breaking. And now I don't know if this is something we can come back from. They sat in silence for a long moment, the weight of their broken marriage hanging in the air. Finally, Brian stood. I'll sleep in the guest room for now. We'll figure out a schedule for the kids and take it one day at a time. Emma nodded, wiping her eyes. Okay, she said softly. As Brian walked away, he felt a glimmer of resolve forming within him. He didn't know what the future held, but one thing was clear. He needed to focus on himself and his kids. The road ahead would be difficult, but he was determined to find his way through it. The morning sunlight seeped through the blinds as Brian stared at the ceiling of the guest room. He hadn't slept much, and the distant sound of Emma moving around in the kitchen only deepened the ache in his chest. He had told himself he'd take it one day at a time, but the cracks in his marriage felt like chasms now. The house was unusually quiet when he walked downstairs. Emma sat at the dining table with their two children, Lily and Max, both in their early teens. Their faces were bright as they chatted about school projects and weekend plans, oblivious to the turmoil simmering beneath the surface. Brian managed a smile as he joined them, sitting across from Emma. Her eyes met his briefly before darting away. The kids didn't notice the tension between their parents, but Brian knew it was only a matter of time before they started asking questions. Dad, can we go to the park this weekend? Lily asked, her face lighting up. We haven't gone. In so long, Brian nodded, grateful for the distraction. Sure, sweetheart. We'll make it happen. Emma's lips pressed into a thin line, but she stayed silent. After breakfast, she retreated to the bedroom while Brian lingered in the kitchen, cleaning up and trying to steady his nerves. Later that day, as the kids busied themselves with homework, Brian found himself sitting in his car again, unable to stay cooped up in the house. He drove aimlessly for a while before ending up at the local coffee shop, where he often went to clear his head. The familiar hum of chatter and the smell of freshly brewed coffee grounded him. He ordered his usual, a black coffee with a splash of milk, and found a corner table where he could think. As he sipped his drink, his mind raced with questions he had no answers to. Was there a chance to rebuild trust? Did he even want to? And if not, what would life look like as a single father? His phone buzzed, pulling him out of his thoughts. It was a text from Alex. Alex, how are you holding up today? Let me know if you need anything. Brian stared at the screen for a moment before replying. Brian, it's tough, but I'm managing. I might need to vent later. Alex's reply came almost instantly. Alex, I'm here whenever you're ready. Hang in there. As Brian put his phone down, he realized he needed more than just a friend to talk to. He needed a plan. He couldn't let this situation define him or his relationship with his kids. When he returned home that evening, the atmosphere was tense. Emma was in the living room, scrolling through her phone, while the kids were upstairs. Brian sat across from her, clearing his throat. We need to figure out how to talk to the kids about this, he said. Emma looked up, her face pale. We have to. Can't we just keep it from them for now? Brian shook his head. They're going to sense something is wrong, Emma. I don't want them caught in the middle of this without any explanation. They deserve honesty, age-appropriate honesty. Emma bit her lip, then nodded reluctantly. You're right. But how do we even start that conversation? We keep it simple, Brian said, his voice firm. We tell them we're going through a rough patch and that we're figuring things out. We reassure them that we love them and that none of this is their fault. Emma hesitated before saying, Do you think we'll ever get past this? Brian looked at her, his expression unreadable. I don't know, Emma. That depends on whether we can rebuild the trust that's been broken. And right now, I'm not sure how to do that. Emma's shoulders slumped, and she looked away. I understand, she said quietly. The conversation ended there, both of them retreating to their separate corners of the house. For Brian, the days ahead felt like an uphill battle, but he was determined to protect his kids from the fallout and take the first steps toward rebuilding his life, whether or not Emma would be part of it. The weekend arrived faster than Brian expected. He had promised Lily and Max a trip to the park, and despite everything swirling in his mind, he wanted to keep that promise. The kids' excitement was a bittersweet reminder of the innocence he wanted to protect. By mid-morning, Brian loaded their bikes into the back of the SUV, while Lily and Max chattered excitedly. Emma stood in the doorway, watching silently. Aren't you coming, Mom? Lily asked, tilting her head. Emma hesitated, glancing at Brian. I think I'll sit this one out, she said softly. You'll have a great time with your dad. Brian didn't comment. He simply nodded and helped the kids into the car. As he pulled out of the driveway, he caught a glimpse of Emma through the rearview mirror. She looked conflicted, but he pushed the thought aside. At the park, the kids raced each other on their bikes while Brian trailed behind, his heart lighter for the first time in weeks. Their laughter echoed through the crisp autumn air, and for a moment, it felt like everything was normal. Lily stopped abruptly and turned to him. Dad, you and Mom are okay, right? The question hit him like a punch to the gut. He crouched, to her level, his face gentle but serious. We're going through some stuff right now, Brian said carefully, glancing at Max, who had also stopped to listen. But we both love you so much, and that will never change. Lily's eyes filled with concern. Are you going to leave, Dad? Brian's throat tightened. No, sweetheart, I'm not going anywhere. And neither is Mom. We're a family, and we're going to figure things out together. The kids nodded, seemingly reassured. But as they rode off again, Brian felt the weight of his words. He couldn't promise Emma wouldn't leave, or that he wouldn't. Back at home, Brian found Emma in the kitchen, staring out the window. She turned when he entered, her face pale. How was it? She asked softly. The kids had fun, Brian replied, keeping his tone neutral. But Lily asked if we were okay. She's starting to notice. Emma sighed, her shoulders slumping. I hate that they're being affected by this. We both do, Brian said, crossing his arms. But pretending everything is fine won't help. Emma hesitated, then said, I was thinking about therapy, maybe for both of us. Brian raised an eyebrow. Couples counseling? Emma nodded. I know it won't fix everything, but I think it might help. If we have any chance of moving forward, we need to figure out how to talk to each other again. Brian considered her words. Therapy wasn't something he had ever thought about seriously, but the idea of getting professional help appealed to him. At the very least, it could give him clarity, even if it didn't save their marriage. I'll think about it, he said finally. Emma looked relieved. That's all I'm asking. That night, Brian sat on the couch, scrolling through his phone. He found himself searching for therapists in their area, reading reviews and jotting down names. He didn't know if he and Emma could rebuild what they had, but he owed it to himself and their children to try. As he closed his laptop and headed to bed, Brian realized that the road ahead would be anything but easy. But for the first time in weeks, he felt a sliver of hope. The following week, Emma and Brian agreed to attend their first therapy session together. It wasn't an easy decision for either of them, but both knew it was the only chance they had to make sense of their fractured relationship. The day of the session, Brian found himself pacing in their living room, running his hands through his hair in nervous anticipation. Emma sat quietly on the couch, her arms folded across her chest, as if trying to shield herself from whatever was about to come. "You ready?" Brian asked, his voice tentative. Emma nodded, though her eyes betrayed her anxiety. "I don't know, but we need to try." They drove to the therapist's office in silence, each of them lost in their own thoughts. Brian wasn't sure what he expected, but as they sat in the waiting room, the weight of their situation became all too real. The therapist, Dr. Marshall, greeted them warmly when their names were called. She was a woman in her late 40s with kind eyes and a calm demeanor that made Brian feel, for the first time in a long while, that he wasn't alone in this. "Hello, Brian." "Emma," Dr. Marshall said as they entered her office. "Please make yourselves comfortable." They sat down across from each other, with Dr. Marshall sitting in an armchair next to them, her notepad in hand. "So," she began, looking at them both. "Tell me what brings you here today." Brian glanced at Emma, who looked at him with a mixture of guilt and apprehension. "It's complicated," he started, his voice strained. "We've been married for 15 years. We've had our ups and downs like any couple. But recently I found out things about our relationship that, I didn't expect." Emma's face flushed, but she didn't interrupt. Dr. Marshall nodded, her expression understanding. "It sounds like there's been a lot of hurt. Emma, how do you feel about what Brian just said?" Emma took a deep breath, her hands shaking slightly. "I love Brian. I always have. But I made a mistake. I let myself get caught up in something else. Someone else." Brian's heart skipped a beat, but he kept his composure. "I don't know how to fix this," Emma continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know how to make him trust me again." Dr. Marshall nodded again, jotting something down on her pad. "Brian, how do you feel hearing that?" Brian swallowed hard. "I don't know how I feel. Part of me wants to move past it, but another part of me is just hurt. I can't just forget what happened. It's like I'm seeing everything in a different light now." Emma's eyes filled with tears, and she reached for his hand. "I know I've hurt you, and I regret it every day. But I want to make this work. I want to rebuild what we had. I just need you to be willing to try." Brian pulled his hand back, his thoughts in turmoil. He wanted to believe her, but there was still so much uncertainty. He couldn't just erase the image of what he had walked in on, and he wasn't sure if he could ever fully trust her again. Dr. Marshall watched them carefully, then said, "It sounds like there's a lot of pain on both sides. Trust is something that takes time to rebuild, and it can't be rushed. But the first step is to talk about it openly, without blaming or shaming each other. It's about understanding the hurt and why it happened." Emma nodded slowly, her eyes never leaving Brian's. "I know I messed up, but I want to fix it. I want us to be okay." Brian sat in silence for a moment, feeling the weight of her words. He had always believed that love could conquer anything, but now he wasn't sure. But he knew that if they were going to have any chance of moving forward, he had to be open to the process. "I'll try," he said quietly. Dr. Marshall smiled gently. "That's all we can ask for, the willingness to try." After the session, Brian and Emma walked out of the office together, a strange silence hanging between them. Brian glanced at Emma. "That was harder than I thought." Emma nodded, her eyes red from crying. "I know, but maybe it's the first step. Maybe we can fix this." Brian wasn't sure what the future held, but he knew that this was the beginning of a long road. The road to forgiveness wasn't going to be easy, and the scars from their past wouldn't disappear overnight. But for the first time in months, he felt a spark of hope that maybe, just maybe, they could find a way back to each other. The night ended, quietly, with both of them in bed, lying awake in the dark. Emma reached out and touched Brian's hand, her fingers tracing small circles on his skin. "Brian, I'm sorry," she whispered. "I know," he said, his voice soft but firm. They lay there, neither of them knowing what the next day would bring, but for the first time, they both felt a glimmer of possibility. The following days after their therapy session were filled with tension and unspoken questions. Both Emma and Brian tried to go about their routines, but the heavy weight of their issues lingered in the background. It felt like every conversation was shadowed by the memories of what had happened. Emma tried to regain some sense of normalcy, making meals, taking care of their home, and spending time with their children. But everything felt different. Her movements were slower, her smiles less frequent. She was still processing her feelings of guilt and shame, unsure of how to bridge the gap she had created. Brian, too, struggled to put his feelings into words. He was trying to forgive Emma, but every time he looked at her, he was reminded of the betrayal. It wasn't that he didn't want to forgive, he did, but forgiveness wasn't something that could be rushed. The wounds were still fresh. One afternoon, after picking up their kids from school, Emma and Brian found themselves in the kitchen together. It was a rare moment where they were both at home, and Emma decided to break the silence. "I made an appointment for another therapy session," she said, her voice hesitant as she set down the groceries. Brian paused, his back turned as he put the food away. His eyes narrowed slightly, but he didn't say anything for a moment. Finally, he turned around and faced her. "I thought we'd already agreed to continue," he said softly, his voice laced with an emotion Emma couldn't quite read. She nodded. "I know, I want to make sure we're doing everything we can, that we're really trying." Brian swallowed, his hands resting on the counter. "I don't know how many times I have to say it, but I'm trying. It's just hard, Emma. I don't know if you understand how much this hurt me. I don't know if you realize how much I feel like I don't know you anymore." Emma winced, the words cutting deeper than she expected. She had known it would be hard, but she didn't know it would feel like this. She had been expecting some kind of understanding, but instead, she saw the truth in Brian's eyes. He was still struggling. "I do understand," she whispered, her eyes full of pain. "I see it in your eyes. You don't trust me, and I can't blame you." Brian's chest tightened, and for a moment he thought he might break down, but he didn't. Instead, he let the silence stretch between them. Later that evening, after putting the kids to bed, Emma went for a walk outside, hoping the cool night air would clear her head. Brian watched her leave through the window, a sinking feeling in his stomach. He had always been the type to try and fix things quickly, but he realized that some things couldn't be fixed in a day. Trust, once broken, was a fragile thing. Outside, Emma walked slowly, her mind replaying every word that had been spoken in their therapy sessions. She thought about her actions and the pain she had caused. She thought about the way Brian looked at her, like he was still processing the betrayal, still unsure if he could ever forgive her. As she walked along the quiet street, she reflected on how much they had been through together. Their journey had been filled with both joy and hardship, but this was different. This was a test of something deeper, something that couldn't be easily overcome. When Emma returned home, she found Brian sitting on the couch, his hands resting in his lap. He looked up when she entered, and there was a moment of silent acknowledgement between them. Emma hesitated for a moment before walking over and sitting next to him. "I'm sorry, Brian," she said, her voice trembling. "I'm sorry for what I did, and I know it's not easy. I don't expect you to forgive me overnight, but I need you to know that I'm trying. I'm trying to be the woman you need me to be, the woman I used to be. And I hope, with time, we can find a way back to each other." Brian sighed deeply, rubbing his forehead. "I don't know if we'll ever be the same, but that doesn't mean I want to give up. I don't know what the future holds, Emma, but I'm willing to try too. Not for the past, but for the future." For us. If we're going to make it, we both have to put in the work. Emma nodded, her eyes glistening with tears. I'll do whatever it takes. Brian gave her a faint, almost sad smile. We'll take it one day at a time. For the first time in weeks, Emma felt a small spark of hope ignite within her. Maybe things wouldn't go back to the way they were. Maybe they couldn't. But there was a chance, however small, that they could build something new, something better, together. The next morning, Emma made a promise to herself to be patient, to allow the healing process to take time, and to remember that love wasn't just about the good times. It was about the strength to move forward after the storm, and, for the first time in a long while, she believed that maybe, just maybe, they could find their way back to each other. It had been a week since Emma and Brian's difficult conversation. Things hadn't magically healed, but there was a noticeable shift. The tension between them had softened a little, and while it wasn't easy, both were starting to rebuild. Each day brought its own set of challenges, but there was a sense that the darkness that had hung over their marriage was starting to lift. Just a little. Emma had taken it upon herself to create small gestures that showed she was working on herself. She spent more time focusing on their home, took care of herself mentally and emotionally, and started journaling again. It was a way of grounding herself, of finding a connection with her own thoughts and feelings in the midst of all the uncertainty. One afternoon, after a particularly long day at work, Brian came home to find Emma in the kitchen chopping vegetables for dinner. It was a simple thing, but it spoke volumes. Emma was back in her element, trying to bring normalcy back to their home. "Smells good," Brian said, a hint of a smile on his lips as he walked in. Emma looked up from her work, a smile tugging at her lips. "I thought we'd have something easy. Tonight. I don't want to overdo it." Brian nodded, walking over to the counter and picking up a piece of carrot that had been left on the cutting board. He bit into it, savouring the taste. "I like it. It's nice to have you back in the kitchen." Emma paused, feeling a strange mix of emotions. She wanted to feel good about what she was doing, but there was still a part of her that felt like she was trying to make up for her mistakes. She wasn't sure how to move forward without feeling guilty. Brian noticed the change in her demeanour and walked over, placing a hand gently on her shoulder. "Hey," he said softly, his voice calm and reassuring. "You're doing fine. We're both trying." "That's all we can do." Emma nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. "I know. It's just hard sometimes." Brian gave her shoulder a reassuring squeeze before stepping back. "We'll take it slow, Emma. One step at a time, right?" She nodded, feeling comforted by his words. It wasn't much, but it was enough. The acknowledgement that they were both in this together, even if the road ahead was uncertain. Later that evening, after dinner, they sat on the couch together. The kids were in bed, and the house had fallen into a peaceful silence. It was one of those rare moments when they could just exist in each other's presence without the weight of their issues hanging over them. Brian looked at Emma. His face softened. "I've been thinking a lot," he began, his voice slow and thoughtful, "about how we got here and about what we're doing to move forward." Emma turned to face him, her eyes searching his. "And what have you been thinking?" "I've been thinking that we need to learn to communicate better," he said, his eyes earnest. "Not just about the big things, but about the little things too. I think we've lost that along the way, and I don't want us to keep repeating the same mistakes." Emma nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew he was right. Communication had been one of their biggest issues. There had been too many unsaid words, too many moments where they both just assumed the other would understand. It had all built up into a pressure that had finally exploded. "I agree," Emma said, her voice soft but determined. "I've been thinking the same thing. We need to talk more, even about the little things like what we're feeling. If we don't, we'll end up drifting again." Brian's gaze softened as he looked at her, his hand gently taking hers. "It's going to take time, Emma, I know that, But I want to make this work. I do too, Emma replied, her eyes welling up with emotion. I've never wanted anything more. For a brief moment, everything felt like it was right where it needed to be. There was still so much to work through, so much pain to heal, but in this moment, they had found a sense of connection again. The next day, Emma and Brian sat down together for their second therapy session. It was a step forward, though they both knew there was still a long road ahead. But they were ready. Emma had made peace with the fact that healing would take time, and Brian had come to terms with the fact that trust couldn't be rebuilt overnight. They were no longer trying to erase their past mistakes, but to build on them, to learn, to grow, and to rediscover what had once made their marriage strong. As they walked out of the therapy session, Brian turned to Emma and gave her a gentle smile. I think we're going to be okay, he said softly. Emma smiled back, feeling the weight of his words settle in her heart. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long while, she felt hopeful. The evening wrapped up with them sitting together on the couch again, no longer worrying about what the next day would bring. They were choosing to face each new day side by side, with the understanding that healing was a process, a long, winding road, but it was a road they would walk together. The healing process, though slow, had continued to move forward. Emma and Brian had found small ways to reconnect, and although there were still moments of uncertainty, they were beginning to rebuild something that felt worth fighting for. The therapy sessions had helped them open up more, but it was clear they both had deeper emotions they hadn't fully voiced yet. Emma had become more attuned to her own feelings, realizing just how much she had suppressed over the years. She had kept herself so focused on her family, her responsibilities, that she hadn't truly allowed herself to process the impact of her decisions and the weight of her emotions. There was a part of her that had been holding on to past guilt, and it was starting to surface. One evening, while sitting across from each other at the dinner table, Brian noticed the change in her. Her eyes seemed distant, and her usual spark of confidence was dimmed. "Emma," Brian said softly, setting his fork down. "Is everything okay?" She blinked, breaking out of her thoughts. "Yeah, I'm fine. Just thinking." Brian didn't seem convinced. "What are you thinking about?" She hesitated for a moment, searching for the right words. There were so many things she wanted to say, but none of them seemed to come out as easily as she thought they would. "I've been thinking a lot about everything that's happened," Emma finally admitted. "About how we got here and how much I've been carrying, and I'm not sure I've been as honest with myself as I need to be." Brian raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued but concerned. "What do you mean?" Emma took a deep breath, unsure of how to begin. The words felt heavy, like they had been buried beneath layers of denial. But now, in the quiet of the room, they couldn't stay hidden anymore. "I've been so focused on trying to fix things for you, for us, that I didn't take the time to really think about what I need, what I've been feeling, what's been weighing on me." She paused, her eyes searching his for understanding. "I've been holding on to so much guilt, Brian, for things that happened before, and even for what's been happening between us. I haven't been able to fully let go." Brian's expression softened as he reached across the table, taking her hand in his. "Emma, you don't have to carry that weight alone. We've been through so much, but we're here now. We're working through it together." She shook her head, tears threatening to well up in her eyes. "But I haven't been honest with you, not fully. I've been afraid to admit some of the things I've been feeling, and I'm not sure if I'm even ready to face them." Brian squeezed her hand gently, encouraging her to continue. "You don't have to share everything all at once, but I want to know what's going on in your heart, Emma. I want to understand you better. I want to be there for you." The sincerity in his words gave Emma the strength to continue, even though it felt vulnerable and terrifying. She looked down at their intertwined hands, her thoughts swirling. I think I've been scared," she said, her voice quivering slightly. "Scared of losing you, scared of not being enough, scared that everything I did, everything that happened, can't be undone. Brian sat silently for a moment, processing her words. He had heard the fear in her voice, the fear that had been lurking behind the anger and the hurt. He had felt it too, but he hadn't known how to reach her, how to comfort her in a way that wouldn't feel like an empty promise. "I'm sorry you've been carrying that fear," Brian finally said, his voice soft and steady. "But you are." "Enough, Emma. You've always been enough. And no matter what's happened, I don't want you to think you're alone in this. We're both here, trying to find our way through this mess." Emma's eyes welled up with emotion, and she let out a shaky breath. "I don't know if I can fix everything. I don't even know if I can forgive myself for everything I've done. But I want to try. I want to be better. For me. For us." Brian gave her hand one last squeeze before standing up and walking around the table. He crouched beside her, his eyes locking with hers. "We'll figure this out, one step at a time. I'm not going anywhere, Emma. And I'll wait as long as it takes for you to be ready." Emma nodded, tears streaming down her face as she leaned into his embrace. For the first time in a long time, she felt the weight on her chest lift, even if just a little. She didn't know what the future would hold, but in this moment, she wasn't as afraid to face it. They had a long way to go, but the first step was acknowledging the truth. Later that night, as they sat together in the quiet of their living room, Emma reflected on the conversation they'd had. There was still so much to work through, but she was beginning to realize that healing wasn't about perfection. It was about progress, and as long as they kept moving forward, even in small ways, they had a chance at rebuilding what they once had. The next day, Emma took another step in her healing process. She decided to reach out to a friend she hadn't spoken to in months, someone she distanced herself from during the hardest parts of her marriage. It wasn't about seeking validation or asking for advice. It was about reconnecting with a part of herself she had neglected. As the call rang, she held her breath, wondering if this was the right move. The phone rang on the second attempt, and Emma's heart skipped a beat as she waited for the familiar voice on the other end. She hadn't spoken to Lara in what felt like ages. Their friendship had always been a source of comfort for Emma, but somewhere along the way, she had distanced herself, too overwhelmed by her marriage and the struggles she faced. But now, she knew she needed to open up to someone who could offer a perspective free from the tension of her daily life. "Hello?" Lara's voice came through, warm and slightly surprised. "Hey, it's Emma," she replied, feeling a mix of relief and nervousness. "I know it's been a while." "Emma, wow, I didn't expect to hear from you." "How have you been?" Lara asked, her tone instantly comforting. It felt like no time had passed at all, and that gave Emma the courage to speak freely. "I've been okay," Emma started, then paused, searching for the right words. "No, I've been a mess, to be honest. A lot's been going on, and I didn't know who to turn to." Lara's voice softened. "I'm sorry to hear that. Do you want to talk about it?" The openness in Lara's voice was exactly what Emma needed. It was a safe space where she could be herself, no pretenses, no judgments. So she took a deep breath and began to speak about the turmoil she had been living with. The hurt, the confusion, the moments of doubt in her marriage. She shared the emotional exhaustion, the struggles with Brian, and the fears she had been carrying for so long. As she spoke, Emma could feel the weight of her words lifting. She hadn't realized how much she had been bottling up until she started to voice it out loud. Lara listened attentively, offering the occasional word of encouragement, but mostly, she just let Emma speak. "I'm sorry I haven't reached out sooner," Emma said, as she finished recounting the events. "I just didn't know what to say, or how to even begin." "You don't have to apologize," Lara said gently. "Sometimes we get so caught up in our own stuff that we forget to lean on the people who care about us. But I'm here now, and I'm glad you called." The conversation continued for a while longer, with Emma feeling lighter after every sentence. By the end of the call, she felt a renewed sense of clarity. It was good to reconnect with Lara, and she realized that part of her healing would involve allowing others in again. letting go of the isolation she had imposed on herself. After hanging up, Emma sat in quiet reflection. She had shared so much, and yet there was still one big thing she hadn't addressed. It had been on her mind since the conversation with Brian. The feeling that she needed to make a choice about where she was going in her life, and whether or not she could fully forgive herself, or even Brian. It was clear that the path forward wasn't going to be simple. Forgiveness, both for herself and for Brian, wasn't something that could be rushed. But maybe, just maybe, it could be earned over time. One conversation at a time, one decision at a time. The next morning, after a restless night of sleep, Emma woke up with a new sense of purpose. She could no longer let fear dictate her choices. She had to act with intention, not only for her relationship with Brian, but also for her own sense of self. She decided to take the next step. Another difficult conversation, but one that had the potential to shift everything. Emma made a plan to speak with Brian about their future, to address the deeper issues that had been swept under the rug for too long. As she got dressed, she glanced at the photo of them on their wedding day, a moment frozen in time. It had been a day of hope, of dreams for the future. Emma realized she couldn't keep holding on to the past. She needed to face the reality of the present and decide what kind of future she wanted to build. Later that evening, as the sun set and the soft glow of the living room lights filled the space, Brian walked into the room. Emma had been waiting for this moment, trying to gather the courage to speak what had been weighing on her heart. Brian, noticing her serious expression, sat down across from her. "What's going on, Em?" She took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment. "I think it's time we really talk about us, about where we're headed. I've been carrying a lot of guilt and doubt, but I'm ready to figure this out, together." Brian looked at her, his eyes full of concern, but also a glimmer of hope. "I'm ready to talk too. I don't want to lose you, Emma. I want to do whatever it takes." She nodded, feeling her heart race as the conversation unfolded. There was so much they needed to address, but for the first time in a long time, it felt like they were on the same page. The conversation stretched into the night, filled with tears, apologies, and a shared commitment to rebuild what had been broken. Emma was learning that healing didn't mean everything would be perfect. It meant showing up, being vulnerable, and making choices that aligned with the future they both wanted. As the night wore on, Emma felt a shift inside her. This wasn't the end, but a new beginning. Whatever came next, she knew they had both taken the first steps toward healing. And that was enough for now. The days following that difficult conversation felt like an emotional roller coaster for Emma. Every day brought new challenges and moments of self-reflection. But the one thing she felt certain of was that she was no longer hiding from the truth. She had confronted her fears, her doubts, and her past mistakes, and for the first time in a long time, she felt a sense of clarity. Brian, too, had been making an effort. He was more present, more attentive, and most importantly, more open. They had both agreed that their relationship needed time to heal, but there was a quiet understanding between them that they were willing to try. There was no promise that everything would be perfect right away, but there was a commitment to moving forward together. Emma spent more time focusing on herself during this period. She had started journaling again, pouring her thoughts onto the pages like she used to when she was younger. It was her way of processing the chaos inside, of making sense of her emotions. She knew that self-discovery was a key part of her healing, understanding who she was outside of her marriage, outside of the pain, and finding her own strength again. One afternoon, as Emma sat in the park, watching the leaves gently fall from the trees, she felt a quiet sense of peace wash over her. It was a rare moment of calm in the storm that had been her life for the past few months. She realized how much she had changed, how much she had grown. And it wasn't just about her relationship with Brian, it was about her relationship with herself. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. pulling her from her thoughts. It was a text from Lara. "Hey, I'm thinking of you. How are you holding up?" Emma smiled as she read the message. Lara's support had been unwavering, and it had meant the world to her during the hardest times. She quickly typed a response. Doing okay. A lot has changed, but I'm learning to take it one step at a time. Thank you for being there for me. Always, Emma. You're stronger than you know." Reading those words, Emma felt a surge of gratitude. She had been surrounded by people who cared, even when she couldn't fully appreciate it. It made her realize how important it was to lean on the ones who loved her, to allow herself to be supported when she needed it most. As the weeks passed, Emma and Brian continued to rebuild their trust and communication. They made small efforts to reconnect, cooking dinner together, taking long walks, and having honest conversations without the weight of past mistakes looming over them. It wasn't easy, but they were both committed to moving forward, taking things day by day. One evening, as they sat on the couch, Emma looked over at Brian, her heart full of both hope and uncertainty. They had been through so much, but in some ways, they were stronger than ever. "Do you ever wonder where we'll be in a year?" she asked quietly, her voice tinged with both curiosity and vulnerability. Brian met her gaze, a soft smile playing on his lips. "I think about it all the time, and I'm not sure exactly where we'll be, but I know we're headed in the right direction." Emma nodded, feeling a weight lift from her chest. There was no map for this journey, no clear answers, but for the first time in a long time, she felt like she had the courage to embrace the unknown, and maybe, just maybe, that was enough. As the night drew to a close, Emma felt a sense of peace that she hadn't felt in months. She wasn't sure what the future held, but she knew one thing for certain. She had learned to trust herself again, and that was the most important lesson of all.